Something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. There's numerous people running up the hill.
What transpires that day in Dallas, Texas, is one of the most contentious mysteries of our time, setting off a hailstorm of criticism and endless conspiracy theories, leading a ballistics expert on a 25-year quest for the truth.
You know what your critics say. They say this is absurd. They rank it with the tooth fairy, bottom of the barrel kind of theory. You know you're going to get a lot of criticism when you publish this theory.
Why, of course we are. But then again, those people don't know anything about firearms, ballistics, or bullet performance.
Now an Australian detective is determined to solve this murder.
If you're going to a crime scene and you're trying to work out what's actually going on, invariably you'll find out through your witnesses. They'll solve it for you.
Who killed President John F. Kennedy?
The policeman says, no, you cannot come in here. You cannot come in here.
Can these two experts finally solve the greatest cold case mystery of all time? The broad facts of the most famous assassination in history are simple.
The usual welcoming committee presents Mrs. Kennedy with a bouquet of red roses.
It is a routine visit to Dallas on the presidential campaign trail. The sun is shining, the people are welcoming, and the top of the presidential limousine is down.
The president's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark.
At 12:30 p.m., shots are fired. President John F. Kennedy is mortally wounded, and Texas Governor John Connally is seriously wounded.
It was definitely the president's car. We could see the First Lady's spacesuit. That's the only identification we could see.
Both men are rushed to nearby Parkland Hospital. A half hour later, President Kennedy is pronounced dead.
The President of the United States is dead.
Just 45 minutes after the assassination, Kennedy's suspected killer, Lee Harvey Oswald, murders a police officer before finally being arrested in a Dallas movie theater. President Kennedy's body is flown to Washington for the autopsy. 2 days later, Dallas club owner Jack Ruby shoots and kills Oswald in an underground parking lot. The next day, President Kennedy is buried at Arlington Cemetery. That's where the accepted facts of the Kennedy assassination end, and the mystery of what actually happened begins. In response to widespread suspicion that Lee Harvey Oswald was part of a greater criminal plot, President Lyndon Johnson appoints Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren to investigate.
Lee Harvey Oswald's Carcano rifle?
Over the next 10 months in closed court sessions, 552 witnesses give testimony to the Warren Commission, resulting in an 888-page report released to the public. Yet 50 years later, President Kennedy's murder is still shrouded in suspicion, mystery, and conspiracy theories. The majority of Americans still do not believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman. How can a crime that is witnessed by hundreds of people at the scene, filmed by at least 30 of them, watched by billions on television, and more documented than any other assassination in history, remain so unresolved? Many people have tried to come up with an answer, but few with the crime-solving pedigree of Colin McLaren. After spending 18 years in the Australian police force investigating the country's most baffling crimes, he makes a surprising discovery when he turns his formidable skills on the JFK case.
I learned that no other career detective had ever undertaken a cold case study, a forensic analysis of all of the evidence, all of the testimony, and I wanted to be the first.
Colin McLaren is one of the most celebrated undercover detectives in Australia during the 80s and 90s. He is responsible for one of the largest undercover stings in Australia's history that sent 11 mafia bosses to prison. His time undercover has taught him to solve crimes from the inside. This makes him uniquely equipped to see things other investigators may not. He turns his attention to the most famous one in history.
One thing I had to do is I had to see the crime scene. Once I got there, it was quite like a time warp. There was the book depository, the 6th floor window. There was the underpass, the infamous grassy knoll. They were all there. Once you turn from Houston Street onto Elm Street, which is the last of the motorcade, it bends to the left as you go down this quite pronounced gradient. It sort of snaked along. It was a seriously unusual and difficult terrain to get off a shot, or two or three. I looked up at the 6th floor of the book depository. I had great trouble understanding why 24 Secret Service agents hadn't seen a man with a gun. Other witnesses, I'd found 10 that had seen a man with a gun or a man or an image from that window, yet the Secret Service agents missed it. I then went into the book depository on the 6th floor. It was eerie. It was a bit daunting, really, because as a detective I've been to many crime scenes, but this is the holy grail of all crime scenes. This is the most unsolved of all crime scenes in the world. To be standing within it, I got an enormous sense of understanding is probably the best word, and it was very unsettling, but it was also very helpful for me to be there. Oswald's perch was much smaller, much tighter than I ever imagined from all of the photographs I studied. All he had to brace himself was a couple of cardboard cartons as he fed his clunky World War II bolt-action weapon with ammunition and took aim. Let's not forget one very important factor, the adrenaline, the pressure, the nerves he must have felt as he sighted up the president. The thing that struck me most about this case, that even after 50 years, with the majority of the American people rejecting the Warren Commission findings, it's those findings that stand today, and that is that a lone nut named Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots in less than 6 seconds and killed JFK. Then Jack Ruby kills Oswald. There was no conspiracy, and both men acted alone.
Colin is well aware he's not the first person to seriously question the Warren Commission's findings. In 1967, CBS put these findings to the test.
CBS News had a tower and target track constructed to match exactly the heights and distances in Dealey Plaza. The target, a standard FBI silhouette, moved by electric motor at 11 miles an hour, approximately the speed of the presidential limousine. 11 volunteer marksmen took turns, firing clips of 3 bullets each at the moving target.
One of the main questions the CBS special asks, is it physically possible to fire 3 rounds in 5.6 seconds or less using the antiquated Mannlicher Kakano bolt-action rifle Lee Harvey Oswald had used?
It is a clumsy weapon to bring to that sort of a fight. Lee Harvey Oswald, let's be honest, he had a bit of junk. It was army surplus, it is incredibly heavy and is prone to jamming. The sights, of course, weren't aligned properly.
The credibility of the Warren Commission's findings rest on this test.
A weapons engineer had the best score. 3 hits in 5.2 seconds.
His name is Howard Donahue. It takes him 3 tries, but thanks to his efforts, CBS concludes that it's plausible to fire the 3 shots on target in less than 5.6 seconds.
Here we have an outstanding ballistics man who did that controlled test. However, it was his 3rd attempt. So he had a few rehearsals. Lee Harvey Oswald, he was on the fly. He had his gun out and he was pointing it and he was shooting. He had no rehearsals and he was riddled with obviously adrenaline and pressure, nerves and probably fear. So I can't accept that he could get 3 away in that amount of time at all.
Neither could Howard Donahue. In addition to being the best marksman, he was also a ballistics expert, and his test on CBS News launches him into a personal investigation that would become an obsession. Donahue's quest to re-examine the Kennedy assassination forms the basis of Colin McLaren's modern forensic investigation.
Howard Donahue was a ballistics expert. If he hadn't done what he did, I wouldn't be here today.
After participating in the CBS rifle tests, Howard Donahue doubts that Lee Harvey Oswald could fire 3 shots in 5.6 seconds. What begins as a nagging doubt turns into a 25-year search to reveal the truth about JFK's assassination.
He started to just dig. He would find an inconsistency and didn't understand it. He just had that kind of mind. He wanted to understand.
Howard Donahue was a highly decorated pilot in World War II. Born in upstate New York, he grows up in Baltimore, Maryland, where he lives until his death in 1999.
My father was around guns all his life. From when he was 11 and got that first .22 caliber rifle, he always had a gun.
As a child, Colleen Donahue was immersed in her father's enthusiasm for guns and obsession with JFK's assassination.
He was always hunting and fishing and just loved the outdoor life. And then, of course, as he got older, he qualified as an expert marksman and had a gun shop, and he was a gunsmith and an expert witness in court.
After the CBS special airs, a popular men's magazine of the era asks Donahue to write an article backing the Warren Commission's findings.
He was approached by a True magazine, which was one of the top men's magazines in the United States in the 60s. Featured a lot of, outdoor hunting and fishing stories and true adventure. And they wanted him to write a story based on his involvement with the CBS special, but basically looking at the Warren Commission and concluding why it was accurate. And so Howard said, yeah, I'd like to do that.
Bonner Menninger is a Kansas-based journalist who chronicled Howard Donahue's search to uncover what happened in Dallas.
His mission was to focus on the empirical evidence, to not concern himself with the various conspiracy theories, but really bear down on the ballistics, on the trajectory of the shots, the way the bullets performed, the wounds they caused, and see where that led.
First, Donahue looks at ballistics. The Warren Commission found that Oswald fired 3 shots. His first shot, which became known as the single bullet, passed through Kennedy's neck, wounding him and Texas Governor John Connally. Oswald's second shot missed entirely, and his third shot hit JFK in the head and killed him. Donahue decides to examine each of the 3 shots. What the Commission determined to be Oswald's first shot is probably the most contentious. The Commission found that the bullet struck President Kennedy at the base of his neck, just to the right of his spine, exited his throat below the Adam's apple, struck Governor Connally beneath and behind his right armpit, shattered 4 inches of Connally's 5th rib, exited below his right nipple, and crashed through his right wrist, before finally lodging 2 inches deep in Connally's left thigh. For many critics of the Warren Commission, the 2 men's positions in the presidential limousine rule out the single bullet theory. The critics find it preposterous that a bullet slanting down from the right rear of the president could pierce his throat, make a sharp right turn, and enter the extreme right side of Connally's back. Initially, Donahue was inclined to agree that the Commission's single bullet theory is improbable. Then he discovers that Connally and his wife Nellie are riding in jump seats. These seats were not in a direct line with the president and Jackie's places in the back seat of the limousine. The jump seats were close to the centre of the car and much lower than the bench seats the Kennedys rode in, which means that Governor Connally was sitting much lower and further inboard than it appeared. Donahue places Connally where he was actually sitting with his body turned. The bullet's trajectory lines up perfectly. To Donahue, the slug's seemingly impossible dogleg turn now makes perfect sense. Donahue makes an amazing discovery. He proves that the Warren Commission's often ridiculed single bullet theory is in fact correct, despite the fact that the Commission got the bullet's trajectory completely wrong. But another inconsistency in the Warren Commission's findings continues to puzzle Donahue. The Commission's critics argue that the bullet that hit Kennedy and Connally was too pristine to have ripped through 2 men.
A bullet, in fact, was found at Parkland Hospital, which was considered likely to have been from Governor Connally. It was found on a stretcher, and the bullet was relatively intact, and critics said, well, how could a bullet have gone through 2 men and caused so many wounds and not been damaged? Howard went down to the National Archives in Washington and looked at the bullet with a jeweler's loupe, and to his trained eye, the bullet, in fact, was deformed and not pristine. This contention that the bullet was perfect was a fallacy.
This is further proof to Donahue that the Warren Commission's single bullet theory was correct. But does the bullet match the gun? Firearms expert FBI agent Robert Frazier answers that question before the Warren Commission.
Mr. Frazier, I now hand you Commission Exhibit 399, which is a bullet which was found in the Parkland Hospital following the assassination. Are you familiar with this exhibit?
Yes, sir. This is a bullet which was delivered to me in the FBI laboratory on November 22nd.
And did you examine this exhibit to determine whether it had been fired in Exhibit 139, Lee Harvey Oswald's Carcano rifle?
Yes, sir.
And what was your conclusion?
It was. Exhibit 399 was fired from the rifle 139.
The FBI tests showed that the marks on the bullet matched the chamber of Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle. That's equivalent to fingerprints.
That is to the exclusion of all other rifles?
Yes, sir.
Arlen Spector, Assistant Counsel for the Warren Commission, is credited with conceiving the Commission's single bullet theory.
Did you hear shots?
Many critics of the report believe Spector geared his questions to continuously support this theory. Donahue agrees that the single bullet struck the two men, but he wonders if that was actually the first of the three shots, as the Commission found. Because Donahue knows about Governor Connolly's frequent public disagreement with this key finding.
I am convinced beyond any doubt that I was not struck by the first bullet. I know that I heard the first shot, that I turned to my right to see what was happening. Seeing nothing, I was in the process of turning to my left, and I was struck by a second shot. The third shot struck the president, but did not strike me. Now, as I said earlier, this testimony was presented to the Warren Commission. They chose to disagree with my interpretation and my memory of what had occurred.
Donahue discovers that Senior Secret Service agent Roy Killerman's testimony also contradicts the Commission's order of shots. Roy Killerman was riding in the front seat of the presidential limousine.
That's right.
He describes what he heard after the first shot.
There was a report like a firecracker, a pop. And as I turned my head to the right to view whatever it was or see whatever it was, I heard a voice from the back seat, and I firmly believe it was the president's. My God, I'm hit. And I turn around and he's got his hand up like this.
Indicating right hand up toward his neck?
That's right, sir.
How could President Kennedy say this if that first shot had cut through his throat and windpipe the way the Commission said it did? And if that first shot didn't strike the president, where did it go?
Why did the Warren Commission say that the first shot hit JFK in the back of the neck? There is ample corroborative evidence from many witnesses that saw the first shot hit the pavement and ricochet off.
Virgie Ratchley was a bookkeeper at the book depository. In her Warren Commission statement, she says she saw a bullet bounce off the roadway.
So you were standing directly in front of the Texas School Book Depository building?
Yes.
Tell me what you saw.
Well, after he passed us, then we heard a noise, and I thought it was firecrackers because I saw a shot or something hit the pavement.
What did it look like when you saw it?
Well, as I said, I thought it was a firecracker. It looked just like you could see the sparks from it.
Is it possible that a fragment from this ricochet bullet struck Kennedy, causing him to exclaim, "My God, I'm hit," before he was shot through the neck by the second bullet? Donahue thinks so, and is now convinced that the Warren Commission got the order of the first two shots wrong.
As he progressed, more and more inconsistencies emerged, and he asked himself more and more questions, and then you can't stop.
Next, Donahue turns to the third and fatal headshot, and that's what leads him to his most shocking discovery.
Howard couldn't believe it.
In his forensic investigation of JFK's assassination, Detective Colin McLaren examines the evidence that ballistics expert Howard Donahue uncovered some 40 years earlier. Donahue believes the Warren Commission's single bullet theory is correct, but that it got this bullet's trajectory wrong. Donahue also believes that the Warren Commission was wrong about the sequence of the shots. His investigation deepens. He turns his attention to the bullet that delivered JFK a fatal headshot. Dr. James Humes is the pathologist in charge at Bethesda Naval Hospital. He conducts the president's autopsy just a few hours after his assassination. When Humes testifies before the Warren Commission, he is asked to describe the damage the third shot inflicted.
The third obvious wound at the time of the examination was a huge defect over the right side of the skull. This defect involved both the scalp and the underlying skull, and the brain substance protruding.
According to Hume's testimony, the wound extended 10 to 12 centimetres back to front, from just behind the president's ear to just above his hairline. This enormous wound is a total mystery. One bullet pierces the bodies of two men and emerges in one piece, yet the bullet that hit Kennedy in the head explodes in a hail of lead. Why did these bullets perform so differently?
I will refer back to the x-rays which we had previously prepared. These disclose to us multiple minute fragments of radio-opaque materials. These tiny fragments were seen dispersed through the substance of the brain.
Approximately how many fragments were observed, Dr. Humes, on the X-ray?
I would say between 30 and 40 dust-like particle fragments.
This is not the work of a 4-metal jacket bullet. This is more the work of a frangible bullet that is designed to explode violently upon impact.
If Oswald fired both shots, how can this be? Why would he use two different kinds of bullets?
My father knew as a ballistics expert that you don't get one shot that goes straight through and one shot that blows right up from the same gun and the same ammo. It's just, that isn't how it works. But this seemed to be something that everybody was either overlooking or just not talking about. And that was a glaring omission to him, and he realized that this was the key to the whole thing.
Colin McLaren wants to see the difference in bullet performance, starting with the full metal jacket bullet that Oswald used in his Mannlicher Carcano rifle.
This is a 4-metal jacket round. It's a Carcano 6.5mm round. It's designed for warfare. It's designed to travel. And that is, if a soldier gets hit with something like this, it will go straight through the body of the soldier, giving him a chance to go to hospital and then eventually go home and be eliminated from the warfare.
Ready to fire. Firing.
Straight through.
Colin, I think we're seeing a typical full metal jacket drive-through. Drills a hole, clean as a whistle.
This is a .223 frangible hollow point round. And being a frangible round, it's designed to explode upon impact. And the results are devastating.
Range is going hot. Ears and eyes. Ready to fire.
Donahue has concluded that the bullet which struck Kennedy in the head is inconsistent with the ammunition used in Oswald's rifle. He now focuses on the size of the entrance wound in Kennedy's skull.
This wound in the right posterior region was the measurement that I gave before. I believe 15 by 6 millimeters.
According to the autopsy report, the entrance wound's diameter is 6 millimeters, and the bullet tunnels for 15 millimeters before fragmenting.
Howard talked to pathologists who told him that a bullet wound in the skull always makes a hole slightly larger than the diameter of the bullet.
But Oswald's Carcano bullets are 6.5 millimeters in diameter. If the shot had come from Oswald's Carcano rifle, the entrance wound in JFK's skull would have to be at least that diameter, or bigger. If the entrance wound is only 6 millimeters in diameter, it's simply impossible for a 6.5 millimeter Carcano bullet to have impacted JFK's skull.
Once again, Howard had identified something that nobody else seemed to tumble to in terms of the implications of this evidence, but it's pretty significant.
Donahue concludes that the kill shot was caused by an exploding frangible bullet from another weapon. If so, why were there 3 spent Carcano shells found at Lee Harvey Oswald's sniper perch?
The advocates of the lone gunman theory will always mention the 3 spent casings that were found in Oswald's perch. One of them was away from the other 2. And Howard Donahue explains the single one perfectly. It was dented and probably used as a chamber plug. Could you just show us how that's done, Pierre?
Sure.
That is to stop moisture and grit from getting into the chamber.
Evidence from the crime scene indicates that Oswald may have ejected this chamber plug before taking his sniper position at the window. It's compelling evidence that Oswald fired only 2 shots. So if the fatal headshot didn't come from Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle, where did it come from? Donoghue now revisits the shot's trajectory to see if he can find the answer. The Warren Commission calculated that the headshot came down at a declination of just under 16 degrees.
The trajectory from the book depository was 16 degrees down and about 6 degrees right to left, based on the midline of the vehicle. Even if the entrance wound and Oswald's position lined up, that right to left trajectory would have suggested that the exit wound would have been somewhere in his left side of his face, maybe his forehead, his nose, and not the upper right portion of his skull.
Donoghue decides to conduct his own trajectory tests. He uses the Warren Commission's autopsy exhibits to determine the bullet's entrance and exit points. He drills the exit hole and hopes to trace the line of trajectory back to its source. Donoghue slides a dowel through the skull to line up the trajectory with the position of President Kennedy's head at the time of the 3rd shot. He determines that the shot was fired behind JFK, but from a much lower angle than the 6th floor window of the book depository.
Howard couldn't believe it. Howard believed that it was absolutely impossible for the trajectory from Oswald's sniper position to have caused the wound that Kennedy suffered in his head, based on where the autopsy physicians placed the entrance wound and where the exit wound was on the upper right side of his head. Didn't make sense.
Donoghue has applied basic ballistic science to conclude beyond all doubt that the Warren Commission is wrong. He is now convinced that there must have been a second shooter in Dealey Plaza that day. But who was that shooter, and where was he positioned? Who else may have been carrying a high-powered rifle? Donoghue believes that the 3rd shot could not have come from the 6th floor of the book depository. The only explanation he can accept is that the headshot had to have come from somewhere behind and to the left of the president. Seeking answers, Donoghue meets pathologist Dr. Russell Fisher, Maryland's chief medical examiner. Fisher has been appointed by the Attorney General to re-examine JFK's autopsy, and he reveals startling new information about the president's head wound.
Dr. Fisher told him that the entrance wound was mislocated.
It's much higher, maybe 4 inches in this area here, perhaps here.
Higher. Huh.
At the autopsy in Bethesda, it was down here by the occipital protuberance, which is that bony bump on the back of your skull, but in fact, Dr. Fisher's panel found that it was 4 inches higher. It's at an inch to the right of the midline.
A big difference.
The doctors in the autopsy must have misplaced the location of the entrance wound. There can be no other explanation.
Armed with this new information, Donoghue can now trace back the trajectory of the fatal shot based on the entrance wound's correct location. What he discovers comes as a complete shock.
He got out his drawings and he traced that line back, and he found that it went over the left rear seat of the Secret Service follow-up car that contained a number of agents riding closely behind the presidential limousine.
I'm standing in the exact spot where JFK suffered his fatal headshot wound. And with fresh information and new photographs, Howard Donoghue made a sensational discovery that helps you understand this case. He followed the line of trajectory from that fatal wound, and he discovered that it didn't emanate from high up on the 6th floor window of the book depository. In fact, it was lower down, behind me, where the Secret Service follow-up car is.
Donoghue writes to the Secret Service and asks for the names of the agents who rode in the follow-up car, what weapons they carry, and what caliber those weapons are. The Secret Service replies that they do not disclose the types of weapons they use, other than that agents are issued .38 caliber revolvers. The letter adds that Secret Service agents fired no shots at the time of the assassination. While Donahue looks at the Warren Commission report from a ballistics viewpoint, Colin McLaren studies it with a detective's eye, and he finds eyewitness evidence of gunfire at street level.
There is 10 witnesses that claim to have smelled gunpowder at the time of the shooting at street level.
Dallas patrolman Earl Brown is standing on a railway bridge looking down at the motorcade as it races to Parkland Hospital.
I heard those shots and then I smelled this gunpowder.
You did?
It'd come on, oh, I'd say a couple minutes later or so. At least it smelled like it to me.
That day the wind was blowing at 15 miles per hour, away from Patrolman Brown, that is towards the book depository. So for him to have smelled gunshot residue, it would have had to have drifted up as the motorcade went underneath him, and that's what he told the Warren Commission, exactly that.
Dallas Mayor Earl Cabell and his wife Elizabeth are sitting in a convertible 4 cars back from the presidential limousine.
Well, I turned around to say to Earl, "Earl, that was a shot." And just as soon as I got the words out, the 2 second shots rang out.
Do you remember anything else?
I was acutely aware of an odor of gunpowder.
With the wind at 15 miles per hour from the southwest, as it was exactly on the 22nd of November 1963, and I was really pleased to have that as part of my crime scene analysis, I came to fully appreciate how people in the motorcade at street level were adamant that they smelt gunpowder. More, I could even understand completely that gunpowder couldn't have come from the 6th floor window, not with the wind blowing in Lee Harvey Oswald's face.
Colin McLaren, the testimonies from witnesses who smelled gunpowder at street level are strong evidence of a second shooter. One of these witnesses was Senator Ralph Yarborough, riding with Vice President Lyndon Johnson in an open Lincoln directly behind the Secret Service follow-up car. Yarborough is a war veteran with over 50 years' experience with firearms.
I've hunted all my life, and I've handled all kinds of weapons in the Army. I knew they were rifle shots, and there were 3 of them. A second or 2 later, I smelled gunpowder. I always found that strange, because being familiar with firearms, I could never see how I could smell the powder from a rifle in that high building. You don't smell gunpowder unless you're upwind of it, and it blows in your face.
But if a second gun was fired, whose was it? Colin McLaren researches this mystery. He discovers that in the wake of the shooting, Dallas policemen interview witnesses in Dealey Plaza.
Any detective who's worked a lot of crime scenes will tell you the really best way to solve any crime is through your witnesses. Don't look too far, look on the ground, keep it on the ground, keep it at street level, and keep working your witnesses. They'll solve it for you.
Sheriff Bill Decker is a Dallas law enforcement legend. Decker is one of the cops who ran down the glamorous bank robbers Bonnie and Clyde in the 1930s. He's a Texas maverick, and he runs a crack team of detectives his way. After the shooting, Decker orders his men to scour Elm Street and Dealey Plaza for witnesses. By day's end, Decker's men pull in several dozen witnesses, many claiming to have seen the shooting.
If you go into a crime scene and you're trying to work out what's actually going on, invariably you'll find out through your witnesses. Of course, you've got to grab them at the very start while they're hot and commit them to paper. The Dallas Sheriff's Office found the best type of witness, those that saw something on the day and were prepared to make statements before they could be corrupted from outside influences.
For Colin McLaren, the eyewitness testimony is the key to solving the most famous crime in history.
I heard at least 2 shots fired.
22-year-old Hugh Betzner is standing alongside the motorcade taking photographs.
I also saw a man in either the president's car or the car behind his pull out what looked like a rifle.
Hugh Betzner is just one of the people to see a gun at the scene. McLaren discovers that there are others. Senator Ralph Yarborough is in the motorcade. He also testifies that he saw a Secret Service agent pull out a rifle.
I heard 3 shots, no more. All seemed to come from the right rear. Some of the Secret Service men looked backward and to the right in the general direction for where the explosion seemed to come from. The one Secret Service man sitting down in the car ahead of us pulled out an automatic weapon or rifle, and he looked backward.
McLaren wonders why this evidence of a rifle a mere 4 meters behind the president was not investigated. He digs deeper. Dallas Mayor Earl Cabell is travelling in a convertible 4 cars behind the presidential limousine.
Would you describe what you saw or heard, please, sir?
I heard the shots. There was a longer pause between the first and second shots than there was between the second and third shots.
You did in fact know who had been hit, I take it?
Nope, we couldn't tell. We could tell, of course, that there was confusion in the presidential car. Activity. The Secret Service men ran to that car. From out of nowhere appeared one Secret Service man with a submachine gun. His attention seemed to be focused up toward the building.
All of these witnesses see a rifle at the crime scene. So why did the Secret Service deny it in their letter to Howard Donahue? Even Secret Service agent Winston Lawson testifies that he saw a fellow agent holding a rifle.
I also noticed, right after the reports, an agent standing up with an automatic weapon in his hand. And the first thing that flashed through my mind was that he had fired, because this was the only weapon I'd seen up to that point.
Who is that agent? What Howard Donahue now realises is that his suspected second shooter has been hidden in plain sight all along, inside the Secret Service follow-up car. Only one camera captures that agent at the scene with an assault rifle in his hands. His name is mentioned several times during the Warren Commission.
Howard came to a passage that describes an Agent Hickey with the AR-15 pointing it around aimlessly around the plaza or something to that effect. And Howard saw that reference and he was stunned.
Agent Winston Lawson rides in front of the president in the lead car. He gives a sworn statement about what he saw.
I noticed Agent Hickey standing up in the follow-up car with the automatic weapon. I first thought he fired at someone.
From other Warren Commission testimonies, Donahue identifies that weapon as an AR-15 assault rifle.
The AR-15 fired the kind of bullet that he believed hit Kennedy in the head that ruptures and causes a massive lethality.
When Donahue went through the Warren Commission reports, he found 11 witnesses that could put the AR-15 in the hands of George Hickey. 2 of them at the time of the 3rd shot, the final shot.
Did you hear shots?
Yes, sir.
How many?
3 shots. And then we saw the car coming with the president. And as it passed underneath me, I looked right down, and I could see this officer in the back. He had this gun, and he was swinging it around. It looked like a machine gun. And the president was all sprawled out.
Howard Donahue believes he's finally identified the second shooter. He decides to take his controversial discovery public.
Howard had been approached by a reporter with the Baltimore Sun about doing a story. It appeared as a 2-part Sunday magazine article in the spring of 1977.
In the article, Donahue reveals his groundbreaking theory, but does not name George Hickey as the second shooter.
For the first time in years, the Baltimore Sun Sunday edition sold out. But at the same time, there was a blip, and then it was gone, and it was back into the ether, and I think there was the anticipation that once this cat's out of the bag, there's no turning back, but didn't happen that way.
While Donahue's ballistic science provides compelling evidence of a second shooter, Detective Colin McLaren investigates an astonishing sequence of events in the immediate aftermath of the assassination. Ballistic science expert Howard Donahue believes he has proven that the 2 bullets which struck JFK could not have come from the same gun. He identifies Secret Service agent George Hickey in the presidential follow-up car as the second shooter. Through forensic analysis of the witness statements, Colin McLaren agrees with Donohue's theory. He now examines the behaviour of the Secret Service at Parkland Hospital directly after the shooting.
And just now we've received reports here at Parkland that Governor Connolly was shot in the upper left chest, and the first unconfirmed reports say the president was hit in the head.
By all accounts, the 2 hours at Parkland Hospital was sheer pandemonium.
The lead car, the President's limousine and the Secret Service follow-up car arrive at Parkland at 12:36 p.m, 6 minutes after the 3 shots were fired. Senator Ralph Yarborough is among those in this bloody motorcade.
I walked up to the car where Mrs. Kennedy was still there on the back seat, lying there with her head bowed over, covering her husband's head, his blood running down her leg and on her clothes, and twice saying, "They've murdered my husband. They've murdered my husband." It's the most tragic sight of my life.
Secret Service agent George Hickey, armed with his AR-15 rifle, receives orders to protect Vice President Johnson at the hospital.
Which room?
Right here.
Now lift. Wait, blood pressure.
Secret Service agent Roy Killerman calls Washington.
Yeah, we have an incident here in Dallas. The president and the governor have been shot. We're at the emergency room at the Parkland Memorial Hospital.
Once Hickey helps to secure Johnson in the hospital, he returns the AR-15 to the follow-up car. He is then asked by one of the president's aides to find a priest.
A priest has been ordered. Emergency supplies of blood also being rushed to the hospital. Just a moment. We have a bulletin coming in. We now switch you directly to Parkland Hospital and KBOX News Director Bill Hampton.
The President of the United States is dead. President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The President is dead. Women here in shock. Some have fainted. One word to describe the picture here, and that's grief, and much of it.
Texas law requires that an autopsy be performed before the body can be shipped out of the state. Dr. Earl Rose is the Dallas County Medical Examiner. He is well aware of the law and is adamant about protecting all evidence from the crime scene. But Agent Roy Killerman wants to take JFK's body to the President's Hospital near Washington.
The body cannot leave this hospital until after an autopsy has been performed.
Now, this is the body of the President of the United States, and we're going to take it back to Washington.
No, now that is not the way things are done. When there's a homicide, we must have an autopsy.
Well, he's going with us.
The body stays.
My name is Roy Kellerman. I'm a special agent in charge of the White House detail for the Secret Service, and we are taking President Kennedy back to the Capitol.
You are not taking him anywhere. There's a law here, and we are going to enforce it.
Kennedy's personal doctor, Admiral George Berkeley, also argues with Dr. Rose.
Mrs. Kennedy is going to stay exactly where she is until this body is moved. We can't have that. We are removing this body. Now, this is the President of the United States, and there should be some consideration in an event like this.
Now, that doesn't matter. You cannot lose the chain of evidence.
My friend, that part of the law can be waived. Now, either you move, or we run it over you.
The Secret Service escorts the President's body from Parkland Hospital and loads the casket aboard Air Force One.
I was struck by the heavy-handed manner in which the Secret Service and the presidential aides removed the body from Dallas. Was it simply a panicked reaction to the chaos of the moment, or was it more a deliberate attempt of a cover-up of what happened earlier that day in Dealey Plaza?
To get inside the motives behind the Secret Service's actions, McLaren retraces their steps leading up to the assassination. As Kennedy and his entourage drive through Dallas, Secret Service agents are entrusted to protect the President and the First Lady at all costs. President Kennedy has made 83 trips in the past year alone. It had become common on the Kennedy detail to log in an average of 80 overtime hours each month. During the Texas trip, the Secret Service detail is working double shifts. The past 3 days have been brutal, with no end in sight. The night before the assassination, a number of Secret Service agents go out in the town. Secret Service agents are a dedicated, close-knit band of brothers. The downsides of the job are long hours, endless pressure, and lots of time away from home. Heart attacks, alcoholism, and even suicide are occupational hazards.
The Secret Service agents put JFK to bed just after midnight, and then for some strange reason they went bar hopping, and they were seen to be in the company of scantily clad women, as the Warren Commission called it, strippers in other words. And the drinking went on till just after 5 a.m. before they went back to their rooms to prepare themselves for a 7 a.m. start. The bar hopping must have added some serious overture to the following shift. Probably hungover, certainly not in their best performance.
When later questioned by Chief Justice Warren, the head of the Secret Service, James Rowley, defends his agents.
Some people in the crowd saw a man with a rifle up at this building from which the president was shot. Now, don't you think that if a man went to bed reasonably early and hadn't been drinking the night before, he would be more alert to see those things as a Secret Service agent than if they stayed up until 3, 4, or 5 o'clock in the morning?
Yes, he would. But there are situations where a man comes in from a trip at 1:30 in the morning, and he has to be up at 3:30 or 4 o'clock and be ready to go out at 5 o'clock departure. And we go that whole day until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning.
Well, don't you think that they would have been more alert, sharper, had they not been doing those things?
Yes. Yes, sir, but I don't believe that they could have prevented the assassination.
Agent George Hickey, whose primary role was as a driver, was already in Dallas preparing the cars for the motorcade.
George Hickey was a 40-year-old who started at the Secret Service only 4 months previous to the fatal day at Dealey Plaza. He in fact was gazetted or attached to the garage, that is to polish the cars, check the oil and water and prepare it for the President and the motorcade.
George Hickey was not in the bar getting drunk the night before.
And that had to have been the reason for George Hickey, who was at that stage just a driver, to have to step up, take the AR-15 and take the sniper role on the follow-up car, a set of responsibilities totally foreign to him.
In the days immediately after the assassination, the Secret Service agents are ordered to write statements about their actions that day, including George Hickey.
The last shot seemed to hit his head and cause noise at the point of impact, which made him fall forward and to his left again. At the end of the last shot, I reached to the bottom of the car and picked up the AR-15 rifle, cocked and loaded it, and stood partway up in the car and looked about. At this point, the cars were passing under the overpass, and as a result, we had left the scene of the shooting. I kept the AR-15 rifle ready as we proceeded at a high rate of speed to the hospital.
George Hickey's version of what happened is interesting. He claims that he had hold of the AR-15 just as they were going underneath the underpass. Yet, you've got 11 different witnesses who gave testimony that say very clearly he had hold of the weapon at the time of the third shot. That is, of course, back on Dealey Plaza. Interestingly again is, of those 11, 7 of them are Secret Service agents.
Another eyewitness saw a completely different picture than the one Hickey portrays. Sam Holland is standing on top of the underpass at the time of the shooting. Holland gives a sworn statement to the Dallas Sheriff's Office.
Yeah, after the first shot, the Secret Service man raised up in the seat with a machine gun, and then he dropped back down in the seat.
Agent Roy Kellerman confirms that weapon is in the motorcade in his Warren Commission testimony.
We have an AR-15. It's out of its case. It won't be shown. It could be laying on the floor, but she is ready to go.
Ready to go means that the assault weapon is cocked, loaded, one up the spout, and safety on. In the case of George Hickey, all he would have had to have done was flip the safety, point, and shoot.
But that's not what Agent Hickey claims in his written statement.
I reached to the bottom of the car and picked up the AR-15 rifle, cocked and loaded it, and stood partway up in the car and looked about.
Why did Hickey say he cocked and loaded the AR-15 when Kellerman testifies it was ready to go? Earl Warren confronts Secret Service Chief James Rowley about the use of assault rifles in the motorcade.
Well, I'm thinking this. As you go along in the motorcade, you have men who are scanning the buildings along the route, don't you?
Yes, sir.
And they have submachine guns in one of their cars?
No.
Warren knows from other testimony that this is not true.
For security reasons, I'd like to...
Rowley evades the question.
We have no machine guns now.
Well, I thought I just heard this in the record here, that they had some kind of guns.
We had some weapons, new weapons, yes, sir.
So here we have a situation where the latest weapon in the Secret Service arsenal, the AR-15, is withdrawn immediately after.
Air Force One touches down at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington at 5:58 p.m. The streets have been cleared for a beeline run to Bethesda Naval Hospital, 45 kilometres away. JFK's personal physician, Dr. George Berkeley, is also the head of Bethesda Naval Hospital. Berkeley has arranged for the hospital's chief pathologist, James Humes, to conduct the autopsy. Humes and his team know their efforts here tonight will be critical to any criminal proceeding against the crime's perpetrator. J. Edgar Hoover has appointed 2 FBI agents to stay with the body through to embalmment. Both James Sibbett and Francis O'Neill know their controlling boss expects a thorough report on everything that happens in the autopsy room. The medical investigators must log all forensic samples and maintain a sound chain of custody of the exhibits. Typically, autopsies are conducted by a small pathology team, but this is no ordinary autopsy.
Here we have an autopsy where there's at least 30 people inside the suite. Representatives of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the FBI, technicians, pathologists, all working in this massive crush to get the autopsy done, arguing, talking over each other. The head pathologist, Dr. Humes, even stated in evidence that he wished he could have chucked them all out.
Just stay back a little bit, please.
It was like trying to do delicate neurosurgery in a 3-ring circus.
30 years after the JFK assassination, the Clinton administration initiates the Assassination Records Review Board to release documents relating to the shooting and conduct interviews about JFK's autopsy. Colin McLaren has access to vital information that was not yet declassified during Howard Donohue's investigation in the 1970s. By the early 90s, most Americans still believed the truth about the assassination had not been told. This public sentiment increased with the release of the film JFK by Oliver Stone. In response, Congress passed the JFK Records Act, which led to the ARRB interviews.
In 1995, the ARRB subpoenaed all records to do with the Dallas trip from all agencies involved. They wanted to inspect all the books. Unfortunately, the Secret Service destroyed their documents, all their records, the week earlier. Of course, why would they do that?
Did the Secret Service have something to hide? From the outset, McLaren sees basic forensic practices being ignored. Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman's clothes are spattered with JFK's brain matter.
Their clothing should have been bagged up and treated as exhibits. They were witnesses to one of the worst crimes in history, and they should have been treated as witnesses. They should never have been there, yet they stayed for the duration.
Despite the chaos in the autopsy room, the pathologists agree that a bullet penetrated the lower region of the president's neck, just below the collar line at the shoulder.
JFK's neck wound was very neat. The entry was only 7 millimetres in diameter, which suits a 6.5 millimetre 4-metal jacket round.
At the Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Governor Connolly receives treatment for a similar neat, clean wound.
Dr. Humes, I should take this.
News reaches the Bethesda autopsy room that a 6.5 millimetre full metal jacket bullet has been found on Governor Connolly's hospital trolley. Humes and his team mentally tick off their first missing bullet. JFK's headshot wound is a different story altogether. The round responsible for it clearly hit the president in the back of the head, causing a massive wound 130 millimetres in diameter. Humes concludes the head wound is the result of a bullet that's exploded.
The left cerebrum was disrupted by the explosive force of the missile as it entered near there. I didn't need a neuropathologist to see that the man's brain was blown.
Do you have any recollection now about radio-opaque objects being in or appearing in the X-rays?
Yes, in the skull. There are some little tiny fragments of radio-opaque material which we thought to be bullet fragments. Very fine, sort of granular-looking material. Went almost as far forward as the frontal bone.
We need to clear the room.
X-ray technician Gerald Custer carries out the instructions of Dr. Humes.
Thank you. Custer, it's all yours.
Thank you.
Good. Clear.
Once Custer has taken an X-ray, he rushes upstairs to his photographic laboratory to process the exposures and bring them back for the pathologists to view. Gerald Custer testifies that the autopsy room was a scene of loud debate and that he witnessed the doctors being harassed.
The commotion level was astronomical. The decibel level was extremely high. You had to scream at people at times.
Custer's superior, Dr. John Ebersole, approaches him.
The first time you were asked not to discuss the autopsy, that was which time?
In the morgue.
Okay, in the morgue. That was on the night of the 22nd?
On that night.
Okay, and who was it who asked you not to speak of...
Dr. Ebersole. He made it perfectly clear I was not to speak of this.
If you could, convey the sense of the words that he gave you as best as you can.
Keep your mouth shut.
Okay, that's perfectly blunt.
Now with access to declassified records, McLaren discovers the true extent of the Secret Service interference in the autopsy.
John Stringer was in charge of all the photographers. It was his job to keep it under control. Yet what he saw was a complete mess. He was complaining of all of the chatter, the talking, the pushing, the crush.
Stringer takes multiple photographs, mostly of JFK's head wound. A young photographer named Floyd Reeby works with Stringer. Reeby testifies taking around 100 shots on 8 or 9 separate film rolls. They are crucial evidence.
When you finished with one roll of 35mm film, what did you do with that?
Well, I took it out of the camera and gave it to one of the Secret Service agents there.
Did you ever see that film subsequently?
No.
As far as you are aware, did either you or Mr. Stringer leave the autopsy room with any exposed film?
No. No, you couldn't have got out of there with that. They even took, we had 1 or 2 cassettes. They weren't even exposed yet, and they took that too. I had a film, a 35mm film roll in my pocket. Wasn't even used, they took that as well. They took every bit of film we had.
The FBI records show that 22 colour rolls and 18 black and white rolls are taken. Their care is entrusted to the Secret Service. FBI agent Frank O'Neill recalls handing the film to Roy Killerman. O'Neill later testifies that the Secret Service head promised to forward a copy of all photographs to the FBI, but never did. The chain of evidence stops with Agent Kellerman. Reeby himself never saw the photographs he took.
He mentioned at the ARRB that he believed that images went missing, even though he attended a public hearing on that. He couldn't find those images or photographs, ever. He mentioned how the Secret Service and different people in that room were interfering.
There was a 4-star general in there, and a civilian who I took to be Kennedy's personal physician.
And were this general and this person in civilian clothing giving directions to Dr. Ebersol?
Correct, absolutely.
What kind of directions were they giving to him?
In a sense, the Kennedy family would not like you to pursue this path any further.
Would you like her to come in right now? Would you like... Wait, this ain't... still be here.
We've got the White House on our backs, Doctor. What are we supposed to do?
All right, you have 5 minutes.
Let me put it this way, plain and simple. The autopsy was something that had to be done. Didn't have to be done correctly, just had to be done for record purposes only. Find out the facts, forget it.
Dr. Humes completes the autopsy, dissatisfied with the results, his work interrupted by all the commotion. He stores the president's brain in a stainless steel pail for further forensic analysis. But that never happens.
The pathology slides that were created by Dr. Humes were handed up to the Secret Service, and he stated he never saw them again. If everything in the autopsy suite was on the up and up, you would have had a cause of death sorted out within about 3 or 4 hours. The pristine bullet would have been matched to the neck wound of JFK, the head wound, there would have been a greater understanding of that. All the exhibits would have been bagged, labelled, and a proper continuity and signatures would have taken place. But unfortunately, none of that happened.
Dr. Humes?
Yes?
Do you mind if I have a quick word with you?
Do you mind, please?
Shortly after the autopsy, Dr. Humes' boss, George Berkeley, informs him that Robert Kennedy wants his brother's brain.
He asked me would I give him the brain, which I promptly handed to him in a pail. Then the mystery really begins, because what happened after that, I don't know. What George Berkeley did with the brain is the mystery of the century. And why I so easily acceded to his wishes, I don't know. Other than he was talking about Bobby and the family and what they want.
I need you to make x-rays of fragments of the president's skull.
Days after the autopsy, Dr. Ebersol returns from a meeting at the White House with the Secret Service. He has a strange request for Gerald Custer.
Did Dr. Ebersol say anything to you about metal fragments?
He gave me 3 or 4 different metal fragments varying in size, and he asked me to tape them to the bones.
And did you tape them to the bones?
Yes, sir.
Custer's explosive testimony is evidence of a complex cover-up orchestrated by the Secret Service. He says he was asked to manufacture an X-ray that would obscure detections of an explosive frangible bullet by placing full metal jacket bullet fragments on JFK's remains.
Did Dr. Ebersol ask you to tape the metal fragments to the bones after he returned from the White House? Are you able to say with certainty?
Absolutely. As soon as he walked in, it was the first thing he said. I want these bone fragments x-rayed with these metal fragments taped.
There was no doubt that Gerald Custer was asked to falsify an X-ray. And he did what his boss had asked him to do, even though he would regret it for the rest of his life.
Well, that was the most traumatic. After I signed the gag order, I was told that if anything, no matter what got out, it would be the sorriest day of my life. And I'd spend most of my time behind prison walls.
A few days later, photographers Floyd Reeby and John Stringer are approached by a Secret Service agent.
You mentioned something related to a secrecy oath.
Well, we were told that this was classified information under the National Security Act, and we had to read it and sign it. And if we talked about it to anybody at all, well, we'd be court-martialed.
John Stringer, whose exposures were confiscated at the autopsy by the Secret Service, is also forced to sign a gag order.
Virtually everybody in that autopsy suite that day was forced to sign a gag order.
For McLaren, the Warren Commission's investigation of the Kennedy assassination raises more questions than it answers.
And what I'd learned about the goings-on in Dealey Plaza and the autopsy suite and the Parkland Hospital, I wanted to go through the Warren Commission reports once more just to see if there was anything that I missed, and there was.
As McLaren scours the Warren Commission, he discovers that some vital witnesses from the autopsy were never called, and that, in his view, pivotal evidence was disregarded. Most crucially, the autopsy notes of FBI agents James Sibbett and Francis O'Neill. McLaren discovers that Assistant Consul Arlen Spector meets with the two agents and asks them if they had made any notes in the autopsy suite. The agents reveal that they did, and that Senior Secret Service Agent Roy Killerman took possession of all photographs and X-rays. He promised they would be made available to the FBI upon request. Almost all of these X-rays and photographs are never seen again.
Did you see any FBI or Secret Service agents taking notes?
Oh, that's right. Sibbert and O'Neill. I could swear they were writing a book that night, writing it down.
But Assistant Consul Arlen Spector tells a different story.
In a memo written by Spector, he stated there was no notes made by Siebert and O'Neill. Was this a misunderstanding by Spector, or was it in fact a lie? Either way, Siebert and O'Neill weren't called to the Warren Commission or their notes. Why?
2 months into the Commission hearings, X-ray technician Gerald Custer has a preliminary interview with Councillor Spector outside the courtroom.
There's little doubt that Custer's observations in the autopsy and his story of falsifying an X-ray for the Secret Service would have been explosive evidence at the Warren Commission.
Custer tells Spector his story and waits to be summoned. Spector never calls him. Senator Ralph Yarborough is also keen to testify at the Warren Commission. He was directly behind Secret Service agent George Hickey.
One Secret Service man sitting down in the car ahead of us pulled out an automatic weapon or rifle, and he looked backward. I smelled gunpowder. It clung to the car nearly all the way to the hospital.
In the Commission's Executive Sessions Memorandum, Chief Justice Warren demanded that Yarborough be called to testify. He never did.
Why Warren's order was not obeyed is a mystery. Although he was the head of the inquiry, McLaren believes he was not always in control and that the Commission willfully avoided interviewing key eyewitnesses.
It's not known whether Arlen Spector spoke to any of the agents from the follow-up car. Only one of those agents in the car gave evidence to the Warren Commission. Depending on your point of view, that is either very neglectful or very telling.
After a 9-month investigation, the Warren Commission is drowning in paper. With no modern criminal analysts and no computer systems, it is possible that some evidence goes unnoticed. But Colin McLaren has access to modern cross-referencing databases. With his detective expertise, he uncovers several witnesses whose crucial testimony has gone unanalysed until now.
If an analyst had reviewed the witness statements, he would have seen how often 3 shots had been mentioned. Also how often smelling gunpowder was said by the witnesses, especially close to the motorcade. He would have linked these snippets with other evidence from witnesses that saw a Secret Service agent stand up with a firearm and then fall backwards. Unfortunately, this all went unnoticed by the Warren Commission. I came to realise that the Warren Commission themselves weren't interested in finding the truth.
Colin McLaren's 4-year forensic analysis, coupled with Howard Donohue's ballistics expertise, point to Secret Service agent George Hickey as the man who fatally shot JFK. A case made for who and how. The final question still remains: why? In his examination of the massive Warren report, Colin McLaren sees an investigation that is uninterested in finding the truth. It's the only logical conclusion McLaren can make, given the exclusion of so many eyewitnesses who gave testimony at the Dallas Sheriff's Office.
The 2 men in the front of the car stood up, and when the second shots were fired, they all fell down and the car took off.
Was Marvin Faye Chisholm talking about the follow-up car when she saw 2 men stand up and then fall backwards? We'll never know. She was never asked to testify.
I saw a flash of pink, like someone was getting up and then sitting back down in the car.
Well, the flash of pink could have been the AR-15 muzzle blast or gunshot residue. A number of things, but nobody asked.
I also saw a man in either the president's car or the car behind his pull out what looked like a rifle.
Mr. Betzner took 3 photographs, which were seized and sealed by Decker's men. However, Betzner himself was never called to the Commission, nor were his photographs.
Gene Hill is a bystander who was only 6 metres away from JFK at the time of the assassination.
I saw the president grab his chest and fall forward. And I think I saw a few men in plainclothes shooting back.
Jean Hill was called to testify at the Warren Commission. She mentioned that she thought the agents were firing back. Arlen Spector never persevered, never asked her why or what made her think that. He changed the subject. Why wouldn't he want to know what she meant by that the agents were firing back? Sheriff Decker was in the lead car, looking back towards a follow-up car. His observations could have been very important to the Warren Commission. Unfortunately, he was never called. If ever there was a blatant omission of evidence by witnesses, the motorcade itself would be it. Behind the follow-up car was another 12 vehicles at the tail end of the motorcade. Of the 12 vehicles, all but one was open top. They contained members of the press, as well as dignitaries, and they're all facing forward. However, the Warren Commission didn't call them all. They only called 6, and of that 6, 4 smelt gunpowder at street level. Why didn't the Warren Commission call them all?
For McLaren, the Warren Commission report is a document of omission. Witnesses who aren't called, testimony that isn't heard, questions that aren't asked, and evidence that is ignored. McLaren concludes that the US government is covering up Secret Service agent George Hickey's fatal shot. But why did Hickey shoot the President of the United States? Ballistic expert Howard Donahue has a simple answer.
Agent Hickey reached down on the seat beside him, grabbed the AR-15, bringing it to his shoulder. He flipped off the safety, and at that time he fell over backwards and the gun went off, striking President Kennedy in the back of the head.
Was there a conspiracy to kill JFK? Howard was agnostic about that. What he did do was show that it couldn't have come from the grassy knoll because there's no entrance wound on the front of Kennedy's face and no exit wound on the back, and it couldn't have come from the overpass because there was 12 other people up there. What Howard proved, in my view, was that Oswald didn't fire that shot, and most likely it was fired by Agent George Hickey from the follow-up car accidentally. In the panic of the moment, you know, in the chaos of combat, he's trying to respond, he's trying to do his job. He's probably already acquired Oswald visually, going to return fire, and fate intervenes. It's sad. I mean, it's sad for him, it's sad for the country. It was a tragedy.
What good would it do admitting that one of the Secret Service agents had fired a shot accidentally and hit the president?
Because it would clear up what is the great national mystery, and it would be a simple explanation to what is a very complex question that still bedevils every American.
Well, that's the reason that we have produced the book, Mortal Error.
25 years after Donahue began his investigation, author Bonner Miniger discovers the ballistic expert's controversial theory. He writes a book based on Donahue's scientific but provocative conclusions. Mortal Error is published by St. Martin's Press in 1992. The book names George Hickey as the second shooter who accidentally, tragically shot the president.
When Howard and I started on this project, the first thing I did was write a certified letter to George Hickey, and I never heard from him. And then when we were getting close to finishing the book, I wrote him again, and I explained to him that, you know, you really need to talk to me because this thing it's coming. And then the publisher wrote him, and again, zero back.
George Hickey's signature on the registered mail receipts proves he received the letters, but he does not respond.
My reaction to reading Mortal Error was profound. It was one of the finest, if not the finest, true crime book I've ever read. His ballistics was outstanding and faultless and beautifully explained. It actually caused me to want to jump in with Howard Donahue at some point in my future and help him out.
But Mortal Error does not fly off the shelves, does not cause a public uproar, and quickly fades into oblivion.
He was disappointed, I believe, that the book didn't do better than it did, but people were more interested in the Umbrella Man and ice bullets and grassy knolls. People seemed to want something that was still mysterious and unknown, and his theory was ballistics and math, which is not very sexy.
Over 2 years after the publication of Mortal Error, George Hickey files 4 lawsuits against Howard Donahue, Bonameniga and St Martin's Press. Why he waited so long is a mystery.
If I was so maligned by an allegation of using an AR-15 and causing a mortal error to the President of the United States, I'd be onto it in days. But he waited over 2 years. And that in itself is interesting.
The suit was ultimately dismissed because of statute of limitations. He'd waited too long to file, and the judge threw it out.
In 1996, a paperback version is released. Hickey sues again. In 1998, the lawsuit is settled out of court.
In lawsuits, no matter how frivolous a claim, you have to answer it. And it just kept going on and on and on, and costing my father and St. Martin's a lot of money and a lot of time.
They just made a business decision. We spent too much money fighting these lawyers. We're just going to end this thing. Howard continued to pursue an audience for his story in the book and continued to look for evidence that would support it, but for all intents and purposes, it was the end of the road.
Howard Donahue dies 1 year later, his theory all but forgotten. Donahue's 25-year quest to expose the truth inspires Colin McLaren to investigate this famous murder mystery and prove Donahue's remarkable theory. Both men agree that the third shot that hit Kennedy was the result of a tragic accident.
I really believe this is what happened.
3 shots are fired. The first is by Lee Harvey Oswald. It misses, but a ricocheting fragment of the bullet hits the president, causing him to say, "My God, I'm hit." At the sound of gunfire, Agent George Hickey turns to look up at the 6th floor window. Oswald fires again. The second bullet enters the president's back and exits his neck, hurtling forward into Governor Connolly's back and exiting through his chest. Hickey picks up the AR-15 to return fire and flicks off the safety. As the follow-up car lunges forward, he loses his balance and accidentally pulls the trigger. The presidential car is rushed to Parkland Hospital, where McLaren believes a massive cover-up begins. This forensically constructed account has long been supported by previously ignored eyewitness statements.
I saw the president grab his chest and fall forward, and I think I saw a few men in plainclothes shooting back.
After the first shot, the Secret Service man raised up in the seat with a machine gun.
Both Donahue and McLaren find that 11 people are able to put the assault rifle in George Hickey's hands at or before the time of the third shot. 7 of the 11 are Hickey's fellow Secret Service agents. McLaren and Donahue also identify 10 people who testify that they smelled gunpowder at street level at or around the time of the shooting.
You don't smell gunpowder unless you're upwind of it, and it blows in your face.
To McLaren, the behaviour of the Secret Service agents at Parkland Hospital is evidence that they knew one of their agents shot JFK. Documented accounts of physical and verbal threats and the determination to prevent an immediate autopsy despite the law speak to a cover-up.
Either you move, or we run it over you.
The autopsy in Bethesda, Maryland is also suspicious to McLaren.
Mind your own business.
Overcrowding in the room, the Secret Service's constant interference, the pressure cooker autopsy, lost photographs, falsified x-rays, and the missing brain of one of the most famous men in history all point to conspiracy.
We talked about it to anybody at all, well, we'd be court-martialed.
Finally, there is the Warren Commission itself, with its unsummoned witnesses, unheard testimony, unanswered questions, and unpresented evidence. Colin McLaren believes the Warren Commission had their shooter, conveniently dead. They had their murder weapon. They had a plausible forensic account of a 3-bullet assassination. Case closed. George Hickey never takes the stand to be cross-examined about his statement. He never speaks publicly about the assassination. He dies in 2005.
I think if my father could see George Hickey now and say something, he would say, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what happened to you." He arrived at this conclusion through facts, evidence, and just his knowledge of ballistics. And unfortunately, it led to Mr. Hickey, but it was never his intention to paint him as a bad guy or disparage him in any way, and he had great sympathy for Mr. Hickey.
It's tragic that John Kennedy's life had to end in that way, and in a way, it's almost like he's continued to die through the years because he just hasn't been able to rest in peace. And I would, for his sake, because I admired him very much, for his sake, I would like to be able to see this thing resolved once and for all, put to rest.
Understanding the real cause into the death of JFK isn't about blackening the name of any individual or organisation. It's about the truth and supplying a definitive answer to the American people. An answer no more complex than a tragic accident colliding with a foolhardy assassination attempt. Maybe it's time to see the smoking gun and then to quietly close the door behind history's most talked about and debated crime scene.
Do you believe? Head to sbs.com.au/thesmokinggun to view all the evidence and make your call.